Max Orland, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Nat Fyfe from the Fremantle Footy Club.
Trent Cotchin from the Richmond Footy Club.
Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Patrick Cooch from the Carlton Footy Club.
It's Rory Sloane here from the Adelaide Crows.
This is Tom Mitchell. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Alex Neal-Bullen, the Premiership Demon, is now an Adelaide Crow. Is this a loss that the Demons cannot replace? For the Crows, have they got the missing piece to their forward line puzzle? And for those of us that play fantasy footy in SuperCoach, AFL Fantasy, Dream Team and Keeper, what does it mean for us in 2025 and beyond? Alex is a fantastic human and a phenomenal footballer to boot. His leadership is absolutely going to be a void for the Demons, and maybe we start there. What does it mean for the Melbourne Football Club? Well, they're going to be lacking in a couple of core areas. Number one, first and foremost, leadership. This guy's been such an instrumental piece to the Premiership era, for sake of a better phrase, at Melbourne. And culturally, he's going to be a big loss as well. His presence, his wisdom, his ability to get this group heading in the right direction is absolutely going to be a void that really can't be filled, regardless of what Melbourne do, either with the draft pick that they've received from the Crows or some other movements of what they bring. Players of this leadership and character and cultural build are really, really hard to replace. And so before you even think about what this means for the Demons on-field performance, off-field, this is definitely going to be a void that they're going to have to find another way to replace, because whoever they bring in through the draft with this selection, 99% can put pretty much a high guarantee that they're not going to be able to be a replication of what Alex has been for the club. Just absolutely phenomenal. And you see that with where he's polled in the club best and fairest, not just this year, but over the past handful of years. Multiple top finishes, just so highly regarded internally. To go with his leadership, it's probably the two other things that he offers really, really well. And then there's a third that's probably not really spoken about. The things that Alex is best known is really got some high-end elite pressure about him. When this boy gets into tackling mindset, it's really hard to get out. He brings a swarm and a presence and a pressure that really is hard to navigate. Again, whether he's required inside forward 50 as a half forward or those moments where he's played through the midfield. He is absolutely a high-end pressure player. But to go with that, your boy Alex has got some wheels about him as well. He's not someone that I think so many people outside of Melbourne would be like, oh yeah, one of the fastest players on the Melbourne list has to be Alex. But no, he's absolutely got some speed for days. And then the third and probably the most unheralded part of what Alex brings to football is he's got some decent skills about him. Left and right side of the body, by hand and by foot, whether it's needed to win a clearance, whether it's to bring the ball inside forward 50 or finishing the work of his teammates in front of goals inside forward 50. Alex is a really handy player. I don't think the Crows ever thought he would be available to him had he not made the personal decision to want to get back to South Australia. And so for Melbourne, this is going to be a really hard player to replace, not just from a leadership and a cultural perspective, but as I look over their list right now, there's nobody I see that has that combination of both elite pressure, high-end speed, and good skills that can play both through the forward line and midfield. And if he needed to play exclusively in one, let alone a split of either, I just don't see a player that can do that, let alone then the fact that there were times this year and years prior when Simon Goodwin has needed someone to play a bit of a negating or a tagging role, they go to Alex. And so finding a player that is equally adept as a negating midfielder, a ball-winning midfielder, a pressure forward and a goal-kicking forward, geez, that's a hard combination on field to be able to cover, let alone the off-field, the leadership and the culture that I alluded to. So I look through this Melbourne list and I don't see a like-for-like replacement. So it's going to mean either doing something that's not been alluded to yet, which is a specific player in through trade. I'm not too sure who they might target that ticks the on-field skill and the off-field leadership. It might be a combination. The draft, they might be able to replace some of the skill, but definitely not the leadership side of things as well. So this is going to be an interesting one. I feel like Melbourne are having to change up that forward mix anyway. Yeah, I'm not too sure how Melbourne go about replacing this. I think it's now a little bit of a structural change for this forward line. And that would probably make a lot of sense, given that that's the portion of the ground that's really been dysfunctional. Is probably too harsh of a term, but certainly not functioned to the high-end elite levels that both their backline and midfield have over the past handful of years.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like, to check you have the tickets in your wallet first before you drive 2 hours to the big game. Seriously, you had one job. Now the closest you'll get to the 50-yard line is parking lot D. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
From an Adelaide Football Club, this could be a really, really big win. I could see him splitting his time between the midfield and the forward line, but I think the biggest win he's going to bring to the Crows is inside the forward half. Their tools are at their best, or as good as anyone's combination of tools with Thilthorpe, Fogarty, and one more season of Walker. You put a Rankin, Rochelle, and a Keys inside that forward dynamic, and there's some X factor, some defensive pressure, and some really, really tricky matchups. One of the things the Crows have desperately lacked inside their forward 50 for a number of years, and they've tried a few different options. Ned McHenry, who's now been delisted. Lockie Murphy has been another, where they're just looking for someone that can enable locking the ball inside forward 50 with elite defensive pressure inside their forward 50. And if they've got some goal-scoring abilities, well, that's an extra bonus that they're a damaging weapon, not just a lockdown player. The Crows have lacked for that. Well, Alex comes straight into that spot and leapfrogs every potential option that the Crows have had and will have in this spot. He absolutely takes their defensive pressure to a whole nother level. There's a little bit of lack of love is probably a nice term for Lockie Murphy from internally within the fan base of Adelaide. They see, yep, he works hard, he tries to bring pressure, but there's not enough other things he brings. So is it a direct like-for-like replacement? I'm not so sure, but definitely it's a huge advancement on the defensive pressure inside forward 50. Throw that speed and skill, let alone the leadership and the experience that he has of playing in finals and winning premierships. This becomes a really great win for the Crows. I think he could pick up a little bit of centre-bounce and some midfield presence, but it partially depends what else they're doing. At time of recording, the request has landed for James Peatling. He's told the Crows he wants to get there. Generally, players that are out of contract, like Peatling is, just find a way to get to the club that they've chosen. But at time of recording, it's not landed, but that would probably help fix up some of the Crows' midfield lack of depth, let alone what they do at the draft with pick 4. So I think Alex could and might just pick up some midfield time in season, but I think it's the forward half and the forward pressure and the skill set that he brings alongside that the club are most looking forward to. What does this mean for us from a fantasy footy perspective? Well, it brings a great deal of things. He's got some ceiling about him. He's got a 130-plus score last year in SuperCoach with 4 tons, a 113, I think was his top AFL fantasy score with, again, 4 tons and sort of a high 70s, let's call it a 80 average if we're really honest. It's a 79 in AFL fantasy this year and an 85 in SuperCoach this year. You look at those averages, well, that's nothing great. But from a total points perspective this year, he's a top 10 averaging forward across the formats. And that's before you look at the players that have departed our forward line or that will depart our forward line or the few that might gain forward status. So he's going to be on our draft boards and in our salary cap formats of the game, someone that's really placed up highly. And one of the reasons he's placed up highly is just he doesn't really miss any footy. I think he's missed 2 games in the last 4 years, so plays every single week. But as I mentioned, he does sneak into that forward line and midfield split a little bit. In the last 5 games of the year, he averaged 87 in fantasy and just a clip over 92 in SuperCoach. And so that wasn't an exclusive midfield role either. It was a bit of a split. So if he plays that sort of split role, he's probably not worth starting in Classic or salary cap. In fact, arguably, I'd be very confident to say you should not be starting him in Classic, even in an exclusive midfield role. I just don't see that being the place where he balloons out to a monster score, and the Crows sacrifice the forward pressure and defensive mindset that he brings. So I don't think he's coming into the club to fix their midfield. I think he's coming in to fix their forward line and support the midfield, which is why I'm really confident saying you're just not touching him in Classic, because I just don't see him ascending to that 9,500. And he needs to be if you're going to start him. So for me, sure, look at it as an upgrade if you're desperate and need to, but in Classic, no real interest. While in draft, where he goes is interesting to me. Like I said, we'll lose a couple of options from our forward line this year at the top of the tree, the likes of Heaney, the likes of Zorko. Yes, we gain by osmosis without gaining a Bailey Smith type who should retain forward status after not playing this year. But he'll be in and around that price point on draft day where you're having to give up a decent pick to be able to land him. But I'm pretty happy to not overpay for Alex. He'll be somebody's, if not F1, somebody's F2. And that's probably more an indicator of just where the forward line sits rather than just how good Alex as a scoring option could be. I think whichever coach drafts him on draft day, which would be an F2 position, is where you're going to get him. I think you'd be pretty happy with that. I know he's a current top 10 forward at the moment, but I think F2 space to pay for him is probably right. You do not want to walk on draft day with Alex. As good as a player he is and as decent as that last 5 average is, if that's your first forward selected, I hope you have gone really heavy on the defensive and the midfield line. This is not on draft day. The F1, you want to enter into the season with confidence that you've got an elite forward presence there. It's just not, for me, the guy who could do it. If you look on average, it's much more indicative of where he should be picked, which is kind of F2, gosh, maybe even F3, depending on the drafting format you play. So is he fantasy relevant in Classic? No. Draft? Yeah. His consistency, some ceiling about him. And if the Crows do improve as a side, he should be able to replicate similar scoring to what we've seen at Melbourne, certainly through this year and over the previous seasons. But Classic, no. Draft, yeah, in the middle portion of the draft, I think we're going to see him get picked up a lot. I think this is a huge win for the Crows for what they hope to do in 2025. And for Melbourne, it's going to be a tough replication of him as a player. I think they can do it, but it's going to be hard to replace. But do you agree or disagree on my take about Alex Neal-Bullen and what it means, not just for the Crows and for the Demons, but for those of us that play fantasy footy? If you're watching this on YouTube, comment below and let me know what you think Alex Neal-Bullen is going to average in 2025. If you're listening to the audio podcast, thanks so much for tuning in. If you haven't given a 5-star rating just yet on this podcast, make sure you do that. If you want to keep in touch with us across social media, all the details are in the description of this episode. And while you're there, you can also join our Patreon, get access to our top 50 keeper ranks that are exclusive for Patreons and Spotify subscribers, and all the details where you can get your hands and be the first people to own and look good in some Coaches Panel merch. All the details for that are also in the description of this episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. For every player that moves clubs this trade and free agency period, we got you covered with our review of that player. We can't wait to be back with you talking real soon about another player that's moved clubs.